Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Mandelson, A Homosexual History, a special series from the creators of Bad Gays. My name is Ben Miller. I'm a writer, historian, member of the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin, at work on a biography of the fashion designer Rudi Gernreich.
And my name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
So last week, we left off our man Peter Mandelson having just helped mastermind the Labour Party's return to power in 1997 in this strange cultural moment of cool Britannia.
I feel, Ben, as we get into episode 4, we're starting to understand and know Peter a little better. So I wanted to start with a quote about him written by his former advocate turned critic, Roy, now Lord Hattersley. Quote, Peter Mandelson's rise and fall were built on the belief that the Labour Party could be converted into no more than a vehicle for propelling men and women of talent into the government of the country. He had no time for its tradition, prejudices, foibles and weaknesses, and believed it had to be taught continual lessons about the need to embrace new values. So he behaved in a way that would have been acceptable in a director of a limited company. But politics is more than running the UK PLC. As it is, he is lost to politics forever. End quote. So when do you think that was written, Ben?
2001?
It is 2001, 25 years ago. So I've mentioned before that Mandelson has been this definitive comeback kid in British politics, and why it's, of course, impossible to ever really rule out his return. And so today we'll learn why he got that reputation as we look at Mandelson in power.
Before we start, I wanted to ask a question about one particular element of Blairism and New Labourism that I'm just not sure if Mandelson had anything to do with. And that is this sense of, in Blairism, which is maybe the thing that Starmerism lacks, which was a sense that this was really a kind of moral, even spiritual project, right? Blair seems to really have a fervor of belief in what he was doing, and it seemed to be grounded in a real deep set of commitments.
Yeah.
Mandelson never seemed to share that belief, right? Mandelson was a much more transactional figure.
Mandelson was more, I'd say, more of an apparatchik. I think some of that tendency comes off the back of what came before. You know, we talked last week about sleaze, and I think the country was seen to be in this sort of moral doldrums almost, this sort of amoral haze where people could be, like, where the politicians were corrupt, where everyone was, you know, all those traditional moral values, let's say, were going out. And while Blairism and New Labour had different moral values, I think you're right that it definitely had a very strong moral core, and it was seen as a sort of, in some ways, a purifying project. Does that answer your question?
It does.
I think next week we can talk actually a little bit about the impact of Mandelson and New Labour on Starmerism, and maybe we can talk a little bit about why Labour today is in the pickle that it's in. But before we get to that, Ben, hold on to your hat, because we're going to have a bit of a career roller coaster for Peter Mandelson. So we'll start in May 1997. Labour's won the general election. Cool Britannia is in full swing, and it seems for a moment that New Labour's campaign song, Things Can Only Get Better, is about to deliver on its admittedly quite limited promise. Blair is appointing his first cabinet, with the chancellorship, of course, going to Gordon Brown. And he needs to find a role for Peter that will make the most of his talents across the board. So he puts Robin Cook and Jack Straw into the other two great officers of state, the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary. But for Peter, I think neither of those roles really played to his strengths particularly. Tony needed him to have this power of a cabinet minister, but not be lumbered with the responsibility of a specific department beyond whose bounds he couldn't really go. He needs to be everywhere at once. So he made them this thing called a minister without portfolio, which is a highly flexible role which allowed him to sit in the cabinet and be fully in tune with the working of the government, but free enough as well to be Tony Blair's fixer, to guide the government as a whole, and modernising Labour and keeping the MPs in order and managing the government and overseeing the government's image of the public. Any and all of this could then be in his remit. And it suited him. I was listening to a New Statesman podcast recently about Keir Starmer doing a reshuffle and how Mandelson had made sure that he was in Downing Street when it happened. And he actually didn't have any official role in the reshuffle, but he wanted to make sure that any sort of MPs coming and going into Downing Street to be hired or fired saw him sat around with a coffee waiting and assumes that he's in on that decision-making process, lending some weight to that decision-making process. And that really is a role that he honed within Tony Blair's first year in power. And it's a sort of behaviour that led to the name of his memoir, The Third Man, which of course is the name of the 1949 Carol Reed film written by Graham Greene. Orson Welles plays this sort of semi-spy figure, and it's all about skullduggery and espionage and being at the crossroads of history. And I think that was his self-image at the time. And his public image was coming into alignment with that, into focus. And he too was known as this ruthless master of what was called the dark arts of spin. So Mandelson's image was moving away from this idea of Mandy in that sort of semi-homophobic mode towards this nickname, the Prince of Darkness. And I suspect he probably reveled in those darker nicknames because they are a little bit camp, but they also inculcate in anyone who is about to meet him this vague sense of threat or weakness, which probably worked in his favor.
Just to be clear for our US listeners, this reshuffle is this very particular British political phenomenon, and it's always seemed very strange to me. Most European parliamentary democracies, like in Germany where I live, cabinet positions are sorted out as part of a coalition agreement because there's a multi-party political system, which means that very rarely does one party get full control. And even if one party does get full control, there's a kind of internal system that figures out who gets what posts, which doesn't mean that people never get swapped out or that people don't do a bad job or there aren't ever shifts. But this idea that you would mid-government just call everyone in and rearrange everyone a bit as a way of signaling ... something is very odd, and certainly it doesn't happen in a presidential administration. It seems like such a particularly British political institution in that it seems always a little bit shabby, a little bit rushed, and somewhat ineffective.
Yes and no. It's definitely a very British political institution because it's the result of the very strange constitutional setup we have. So the Prime Minister, who is the leader of the ruling party, so it's not a presidential system. You don't vote for your Prime Minister, you vote for your local candidate. The party of the most candidates gets to form a government, and the leader of that party is the head of that government and therefore is the Prime Minister. But he can, reshuffle, change all his positions in his cabinet. And it's a thing that they use quite often if there's been a prolonged period of lack of energy or there's been some sort of crisis or scandal. It's a way of often signaling, okay, things are going to change. We might well see a reshuffle following the recent local elections, for example, if Starmer decides he needs to go in a new direction. And it really contributes to this sort of, is it small p or big P politics? This like politicking within the party between different factions. Like it can be really encouraged because factions can help try to get their people into cabinet positions, etc., etc. And to be seen as this figure like Mandelson was under Starmer, to be sat there overseeing it, suggests obviously that you have a huge amount of power, which I think we can talk about in next week's episode. But Mandelson's role within the Starmer administration, I think, is fascinating and very pertinent towards the current position of the Labour Party. Right now, we're back in 97, so he's been appointed in the first cabinet as the minister without portfolio. And one of the first major tasks assigned to him was this, in some ways, a bit of a poison chalice that he picked up of his own accord, which was this thing called the Millennium Dome. This was this plan first instituted by John Major's government to build a sort of festival, a bit like a World's Fair or the Great Exhibition of 1851, to celebrate the arrival of the year 2000. And under Major, he appointed Michael Heseltine, and Heseltine established this thing called the Millennium Commission, which was a public body that would use funds from the newly established National Lottery for a number of these millennium-themed projects across the country. And the Millennium Dome was probably the most famous or infamous of these. There were other projects across the country, some of which were very successful, like the Eden Project or Cardiff's Millennium Stadium, and some which are definitely not so successful, like Ceramica, which was a pottery museum on the history of pottery in Stoke-on-Trent, or the National Centre for Popular Music in Sheffield, which was open for less than 2 years before it shut its doors. Like many of these projects, Michael Heseltine had chosen this ex-industrial brownfield location for the Dome in London. It was this heavily polluted site in South London, which had this dual benefit of being close to Greenwich, which of course is the home of Greenwich Mean Time, so suitable for the millennium, as well as being in the heart of the London Docklands, the regeneration of which had been another of Michael Heseltine's pet projects and had seen this sort of transformation of the area from a dead dockland to a financial centre. With Labour now in office, they had to decide what to do with the project that was looking increasingly like a bit of a white elephant. Gordon Brown, of course forever prudent, he thought that £758 million was a bit steep for the budget and thought maybe we should cancel it. But Blair, however, saw this as a chance to link it to the New Labour project, as this idea that sort of projected optimism and dynamism for a new Britain. And for once, he actually ignored the public mood on the idea. So the public mood was very negative around it in the run-up to it. The venue would be this enormous tent, and inside would be a special Millennium exhibition, which would highlight this full diversity of modern Britain. But if it was going to work, it would definitely need to be bigger and better than Heseltine imagined. It would need more money from private donors where possible, so the state wasn't spending too much on it. And what's more, of course, it had this immovable opening date that was less than 3 years away. It had to be ready, so it was going to need some serious hype to get it going. So, of course, Peter Mandelson was the obvious man for the job. Hype is his game. Schmoozing with these wealthy potential donors and his contractors, that's his game as well. And of course, what's more, the Millennium Dome was very personal for him because Mandelson's grandfather, Herbert Morrison, like his grandson, had inherited the idea of a national festival on Labour's victory in 1945, and he was tasked with pulling that off. So this 1951 event, the Festival of Britain, was to commemorate the Great Exhibition of 1851. But in reality, it was also to provide some hope and enthusiasm for this sort of rationed and bombed out Britain in the aftermath of the Second World War. And the 1951 Festival of Britain had been this enormous success. It too, like the Millennium Dome, had been built on former industrial sites, this time just across the Thames from Parliament, which had been bombed out during the Blitz. And as a model, it seemed like a good model for New Labour. It had been realised by a reforming Labour government, and it had been a major long-term asset for London because it had given London the Royal Festival Hall, which would later become the heart of the South Bank Centre, which is one of London's major performing arts areas.
True, although the Royal Festival Hall unfortunately was built in an acoustically ignorant way and sounds just terrible. I wish it were otherwise.
Fair enough, but also it was built in a completely bombed out, rationed nation. It was struggling to put anything together.
Yes. And the South Bank Centre is, I think, architecturally very beautiful.
Yeah, and the South Bank Centre continued as part of a regeneration of that area. I think the actual South Bank Centre was built in the 60s, it was opened. So, continued for another 20 years almost. And then, of course, the other thing about the Festival of Britain is it even featured a giant dome. So that was like a nice little tying together here. And Mandelson was extremely happy to be its hype man. In the Evening Standard, which is London's main newspaper, he said, quote, "The last thing I want is to be bashful in presenting to the world the contents of what will be the greatest show on earth in the year 2000, end quote. But the problem was this wasn't 1951. Britain wasn't breathing a sigh of relief as they began this major project of rebuilding the country. Actually, the nation was in the middle of a economic boom, albeit one that was pretty unevenly distributed. So as we discussed last week, the national atmosphere was less plucky than chauvinistic, and it was deeply cynical. And from the start, the Dome was battling this terrible publicity and terrible coverage. It seemed to stand for the worst of everything about New Labour. It involved opaque lobbying and funding procedures. There was a lack of accountability. There was repeated bailouts across its life.
And then this weird sort of vibe of like late 90s techno optimism, brownfield.
And also the way it was designed as well, and especially the show inside, not necessarily the dome itself, the space, but the show inside. In early 1998, the founding CEO of the Design Museum, a guy called Stephen Bailey, he was appointed as the show's creative director, but the creative policy in total was really a failure. And Bailey actually quit after 6 months because he cited ministerial interference in the creative process, which I think means Peter Mandelson. Peter Mandelson actually flew to Disney World in Florida to get inspiration for the exhibition.
Is this that place that had this strange, like, body thing that you walk through? Oh my God, I've just Googled the body zone. So what the body zone is, you walk into a giant Henry Moore-like naked male and female, like...
Yeah, it's very like Hedwig and the Angry Inch.
Yeah, and then you walk in through the kind of underboob and tour through, among other things, a life-size model of the human digestive tract. I've just seen a picture of Hugh. I can send you a couple of photos so you can describe them to the audience because I think these are such important artifacts of this period.
Yes, so this is the body zone. And as you said, it's this sort of enormous, how big is that? 120 foot something?
50 meters,
yeah,
huge.
Big model of a sort of
orange, very orange.
And tiled in some way. And it's lots of people queuing to enter this giant male and female body. It would be cancelled today as woke, undoubtedly, no?
What was this? The Food and Furniture by Terence Conran, Buildings by Richard Rogers, Art by Damien Hirst, Music by Oasis. It was really a full Britain in the year 2000 experience. Here's another great fact about the Millennium Dome. They set up something called a litmus group to give feedback on ideas of what to put in it. and one of the contributors asked if that meant they were supposed to change from blue to red depending on which party was in power. Would you like to describe this picture?
This picture is from the opening night of the Millennium Dome, which was the night of the millennium when it turned to the year 2000. And it is a photograph of the late Her Majesty the Queen wearing kind of like an overcoat and also a sort of, I don't know, Captain Scarlet from the future. What is that, like air hostess hat? I don't really know.
It's giving like Moonbase 1999 air hostess hat.
And she looks extremely, what's the word? She looks like she's putting up with it, let's face it. And then she's holding hands.
Tony Blair and Sherry Blair.
Yeah, she's holding hands with Tony and Sherry Blair, who have their mouth open. They're all singing Auld Lang Syne, clearly. And I got to say, Tony and Sherry look like they could be part of the Body Zone themselves with their sort of flash photography, open mouth. They can see all their back fillings. It's horrendous. It was very insipid. It lacked direction or focus. It was scrupulously bland in its desire to avoid controversy. I'm actually going to court some controversy here, I think, on the British left, but I think the London 2012 opening ceremony learned many of the lessons from the failures of the Dome, and it ceded to a very small creative team of actually talented creative people like Frank Cottrell-Boyce and Danny Boyle, the decision-making process, and it gave enough control that they could do something actually good, something interesting. In the case of the London 2012 Olympics, it was a sort of 4-hour, £27 million live action rendition of Humphrey Jennings' book Pandemonium about the sort of coming of the machines. I liked it. I thought it was like, who else has an Olympic opening ceremony which features a sort of Marxist critique of the enclosures of common land in Britain? It was a very strange thing, and it was only strange because it was given to a small group of people to determine. So it seems like a small change in approach, where you can really see a difference between this sort of managerial, many hands, hyper-vigilant, designed by committee of the Dome, and then a project like Danny Boyle's. Writing in the Sunday Times, the Labour MP Bob Marshall-Andrews would say, quote, "At worst, it is a millennial metaphor for the 20th century, an age in which all things, like the Dome itself, became disposable. A century in which forests and cities, marriages, animal species, races, religions, and even the earth itself became ephemeral. What more cynical moment can there be for this totalitarian, cocksure, fragile age than a vast temporary plastic bowl erected from the aggregate contribution of the poor through the national lottery? Despite the spin, it remains a massive pantheon to the human ego, the Ozymandias of its time," end quote. And he was right. As an exhibition, it was a disaster in the end. In the year that it was open, it only stayed open for a year. It only drew about half of its projected visitor figures, and it required even more money just to stay open and pay its staff to the end of the year. And it would still be a byword for a white elephant of failure if it weren't for the fact that the structure itself, the actual dome, which was intended to be temporary, was later turned into this major arena for the city, the O2, which has been a massive success. But Mandelson, by this time, had managed to clear it from his desk of responsibilities, because in 1998, he was moved from Minister of Art Portfolio to the Department of Trade and Industry as part of a Blair reshuffle, which was intended to push out some of the Gordon Brown loyalists. So to avoid his appointment seeming like a direct snub to Gordon personally, Tony asked Gordon to tell Peter the good news that he got his new job. But in a classic bit of New Labour subterfuge, Peter arrived at this little dinner at Gordon's house, actually already having been informed by Tony. So he was able to prepare this convincing response, and Gordon thought that he was delivering the good news, but he already knew. With this role, he was elevated to the Privy Council, which is a body of bigwigs in the British Constitution, whose role is to advise the monarch and to manage what they call the royal prerogative. And it's a role that you hold for life unless you get kicked out, as Peter Mandelson did in March of 2026. So when I was talking in previous episodes about this metaphor of courtly politics, an inside and an outside, and how that worked, there's also a literal court politics at this point, and the Privy Council is that court. All this to say that Mandelson was firmly in his imperial era, as it were, his highest success. It really didn't get more powerful and prestigious than to be a Privy Councillor. But his public profile was about to be thrown into a tailspin with his chance remark on Newsnight, which was the BBC's flagship late-night politics and current affairs show. And at the time, it was hosted by this pugnacious journalistic attack dog called Jeremy Paxman, sometimes known as Paxo. He's a big thing in the UK. So Paxman had as his guest a gay journalist and a former Conservative MP called Matthew Parris, who'd actually been a founder of Stonewall in the 1980s. And he was known to be, at that point, I guess on the more libertarian wing of the party, he's gradually drifted further and further rightwards ever since. He's odd man. But Paris was on the show to discuss, ironically, the private lives of politicians and how they affect their public role. And the conversation was following this big scandal at the time around another member of the Labour cabinet called Ron Davies and what he had called a moment of madness. Davies, who was the Welsh secretary, alleged at the time that he had been walking on Clapham Common one evening, as you do, when he was approached by a gentleman he didn't know. This gentleman very kindly invited him to dinner in Brixton, and seeing no harm with learning more about the home lives of the man on the Clapham omnibus, Ron Davies very politely accepted this invitation, and he drove the gentleman to his home in Brixton. And no sooner had he accomplished this selfless act of public service did the man draw a knife and relieved Mr. Davies of his wallet and indeed of his car. So a moment of madness indeed, but undermined somewhat by the fact that most Londoners didn't come down in the last shower. We all know exactly why a man might approach another man late at night on Clapham Common. It's a very busy, very notorious cruising ground. But times were, of course, as we discussed, like they were changing around homosexuality, and Matthew Paris argued this. He told Paxman that there were, quote, 2 gay members of the cabinet at least. Chris Smith is openly gay, and Peter Mandelson is certainly gay. So Paxman had sort of poked Paris for this answer, as Mandelson's homosexuality was, of course, an open secret amongst politicians and journalists and anyone else blessed with eyes and ears. But he was quite shocked that this admission came, so easily. So he just said, I think we'll just move on from here. I'm not quite sure where he is on that, which is an interesting question. Where was he? So in articles that are published 12 years later to coincide with the release of his book, The Third Man, he seemed remarkably unruffled by this sort of outing on TV, live TV. He describes in the book that he had, quote, an initial irritation at the intrusion, end quote, but he regarded the BBC's response as making a mountain out of a molehill. But he said that in 2010 when he and the country were in a very different place regarding homosexuality, gay people in public life. And he claimed in 2010 that, quote, the rest of the media successfully pushed the story forwards by creating a completely artificial argument about the rights and wrongs of what Matthew had done, end quote. And that, quote, when Matthew did this in 1998, I was sitting on my bed watching Newsnight, doing my ministerial red box, and I didn't bat an eyelid, end quote. But again, I think there's this element of sort of a retrospective reputational massaging going on here. Like in the 2010s, you didn't want to be seen as any way ashamed of your sexuality. But in the late 90s, Mandelson was quite keen on keeping it out of the news where possible. According to McIntyre's biography, Peter not only turned down major interview requests from Gay Times, at the time the leading gay magazine in the UK, but he'd also successfully lobbied the Sunday Times magazine to remove any mention of his sexuality from their profile of him in 1995. And after the Paris interview, he very unsuccessfully lobbied the Sun editor, David Yelland, not to run the story.
But wait a minute, didn't we talk a couple episodes ago about a moment when he's kind of outed in this Daily Mail article as having, like, raising this kid, but he lives with this woman and this other guy, and there's a kind of three-way relationship, and it also, not three-way relationship, but you know what I mean? Like, he has a partner, and like, all of this is a matter of public record by now for decades, right?
Yeah. So earlier when he was standing, he wanted to become the candidate for Hartlepool. There was this News of the World article about him, but it was pre-internet, that sort of thing obviously went on file, but it wasn't the sort of thing that most people, at the time, he was just Kinnock's press guy, and that was what the story was about. So people didn't really take notice of it. He managed to fade back into the files in a certain way. He's never denied it, but at this point, he had never publicly also claimed it as his identity, unlike someone like Chris Smith, who stood up in Parliament and said, I am a gay man. This is not something that Mandelson ever did. I think really at this point, he found it as a very useful opportunity to hit back at the BBC and especially at Jeremy Paxman, because he'd suspected Paxman, who he sort of knew within this court, I guess, that he'd been sort of gossiping about him and spread this news on the grapevine about Mandelson having a new boyfriend, who was a Brazilian guy called Reinaldo Avila da Silva, who is currently his husband. So he had a bit of a personal beef, with Paxman spreading the gossip. And according to McIntyre, despite later denying it, he phoned both the chairman of the BBC Governors and his old friend, you remember from his birthday party, John Burt, who was the Director General of the BBC, in order to complain. And soon a memo was circulating all around the BBC from the editorial department, which read, quote, please will all programmes note that under no circumstances whatsoever should the allegations about the private life of Peter Mandelson be repeated or referred to on any broadcast, end quote. it really gives a flavor of the time that someone saying you're gay is an allegation. It's like being openly gay. It's very dated in its way, but also shows both the power of Mandelson and this thing that he's leaning into throughout his entire life, which is being very willing to suppress and even censor information as part of this sort of implicit authoritarianism, I'd say, of New Labour.
Right. There's also something there about the kind of servility, political servility of the BBC, right? That, something like that could be just imposed essentially by a minister in a party in power. I mean, the idea that the party in power could determine what isn't said
Yeah.
by journalists about the private lives of its officials is, if that happened in Hungary, right, under Orban, I think everyone who reads The Guardian in England would be very, very clear about what was going on and would describe it in very clear terms. But when it happens in London under Tony Blair, suddenly it's, complicated and
Yeah,
whatever.
I mean, the BBC, for those who don't know, it's a state broadcaster, but it's also independent. It's not funded by direct taxation. It's funded by a license fee. So if you watch the TV, you're supposed to buy a TV license, and the license fee is what pays for the whole of the BBC, amongst now some other things. But of course, it has to have its charter renewed by the government. The government has lots of subtle ways in which it can directly and indirectly put pressure upon the BBC. And the BBC is always very aware of the fact that it's on quite shaky ground with regards to being allowed to be the state broadcaster. And this is still the case, and it was very much the case under Blair. And Paxman actually cycled over to Peter Mandelson's house in Northumberland Place to hand-deliver this letter of apology. And I'm going to read now Peter Mandelson's response to Paxo as an example of his sort of expert use of it's like a style of like literary high dudgeon, umbrage. So it's camp, it's arch camp, I think. So this is Mandelson's response. Dear Jeremy, thank you for your letter, which frankly I found perfunctory considering what you did to my night and day with help from Matthew. Journalists at my door until the early hours, photographers in the garden, and chasing me all day. If you were not looking for a cheap angle for your interview, you behaved very unprofessionally. Anyone could see where Matthew was going in his remarks. You had more than one chance to stop him and head him off. You egged him on until his remarks became indefensible. If I didn't know better, I would think it was all accidental. But I know how thoroughly Newsnight thinks about its outputs and interviews, and I know what license it gives itself in traducing and demonizing its pet hates. I have been one of these for too long. Yours, Peter. P.S. I do not want a correspondence, so please do not bother to reply.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I mean, like he's some sort of like private citizen who's been put through the ringer. I don't know. It's a complex moment when it comes to outing, I think. We can talk about it a bit. But at this point, I think the cat was out of the bag. This was a point, he was out to his friends and his families, but this was the definitive point where his sexuality became wide public knowledge and seemingly fair game for much of the media. But it was also this inflection point, I think, in British society, a point at which you see a shift towards a much more contemporary reading of gay men, especially, and homosexuality in general. So in many media responses, Mandelson elicited not only sympathy, but a sense that the idea that it was even news was wrong, that it wasn't even a matter for public opinion. And indeed, The Sun, which had, of course, revelled in a very deep homophobia for decades, put the story on page 2, and their own editorial on the story said, quote, "Times have changed. The British people will not turn on Mandelson because he is gay. We say to Mandelson, tell the truth. You'll win respect for your honesty," end quote, which is this classic British tabloid response, is like as though they bear none of the responsibility for, making it personally and politically dangerous to come out for decades and decades. And they just recast themselves as like these chill guys for who it's no big deal, like, oh, come on, Peter.
It's so disgusting.
It's really disgusting. And also it's undermined by the fact that they only actually ran that editorial in their London edition, not in their national edition. So it's not even something that they believed. But outing was something of a big story in the 1990s in the UK. This activist group that had sprung out of this radical LGBTQ group, which was called Outrage, began to out famous closeted gay people. The group was named FROCS, which stood for Faggots Rooting Out Closeted Sexuality, and had the activist Peter Tatchell as their spokesman. And they began outing religious figures and politicians who were complicit in homophobia. According to a pamphlet handed out by Outrage at one of their actions in a church in 1995, quote, "Outing is queer self-defense. Lesbians and gay men have a right and a duty to expose hypocrites and homophobes. By not outing gay bishops who support policies which harm homosexuals, we will be protecting those bishops and thereby allowing them to continue to inflict suffering on members of our community. Collusion with hypocrisy and homophobia is not ethically defensible for Christians or for anyone else, end quote. But could the same be said of Peter Mandelson at this point? Would he be fair game for outing? I think Matthew Parris's outing was clearly not homophobic. He's gay himself. And it definitely wasn't an activist strategy. He's a pretty dry Tory. And he remains, in fact, a supporter of Mandelson, even after all the Epstein revelations. In February of this year, in fact, he wrote, quote, "I know slightly and have been on mostly friendly terms with Peter Mandelson and continue to believe him to have been a far-sighted force in the creation of a sane and successful Labour government, such as we so notably lack now," end quote. And this is in February this year, after all this stuff has come out about his relationship with Epstein over the years.
Outing is a really complex tactic. It has a long history. Homophobes have used it. Gay people have used it. It has been, I have to say, when used against kind of gay right-wing people, not necessarily very effective. It didn't stop the Nazis from getting elected when the Social Democrats outed Ernst Röhm. But it really gets picked up by gay activists in the years of the AIDS crisis, when people who are actively supporting homophobic legislation or actively supporting a homophobic response to it, especially elected officials, it's considered legitimate to out them, to drag them out of the closet in response to that, in order basically to publicly shame them for the conflict between their private life and their public life. And this goes on until pretty recently. The most famous recent one that people may remember is when Idaho Senator Larry Craig was outed after being arrested in the Minneapolis airport men's room by a police officer who saw his foot extend under the door of the stall and tap. And his rather infamous response to that was that he was not engaged in anything untoward. He simply had, and I quote, "a wide stance."
Well, I think in this case, Matthew Parris's outing of him was clearly not, I think, homophobic, but I don't think it was an activist strategy either. I think, to bring it back to this discussion of court politics, I think Matthew Parris just repeated something that was, of course, common knowledge within the court, but not necessarily known by the peasants. Mandelson had walked this quite fine line on the issue of homosexuality. He didn't deny his personal homosexuality. He wasn't out in the way that someone like Chris Smith was out, as we discussed. But he didn't advocate for more civil rights for LGBTQ people either. Tatchell wrote at the time that, quote, "Some even claim he is responsible for de-gaying Labour Party policy. Labour's 1997 election manifesto ditched key gay rights commitments had been in its 1992 manifesto, including the all-important promise to outlaw discrimination against lesbians and gay men in housing and employment. More recently, it's alleged that Mandelson is behind Labour's reversal of its pre-election pledge to lift the ban on homosexuals in the armed forces," end quote. The degree to which Mandelson himself sort of actively, rather than maybe passively, encouraged Labour putting on the brakes on this gay rights agenda, I think we can't ever really know. But perhaps this is a good point to discuss New Labour's legislative agenda around the issue, coming in off the back of the Conservatives' adoption of deep homophobia for the previous 18 years, but also, as we discussed, New Labour's unwillingness to be quite so openly pro-gay, precisely because it was seen to be attached to the loony left. The first action towards equal rights actually happened pretty quickly. In October of 1997, they introduced the hugely important, but now actually largely overlooked thing called the Unmarried Partners Concession, which was this new immigration guideline regarding giving immigration rights to the same-sex partners of British citizens. The Tories had opposed this to the point of actually removing similar rights from straight unmarried couples in order they didn't have to extend to gay people. But New Labour actually put it in as a policy, making it the first time ever that same-sex relationships were officially recognised by the British state, except for maybe the Queen inviting Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears to tea.
Yeah, it is funny that is probably the earliest one. It was just because Britain needed a composer. What about Section 28? Does Labour say anything about Section 28 in their 1997 campaign?
No, not in the manifesto, and we can come on to Section 28. Ironically, regarding the unmarried partners concession, it's today actually much harder for anyone to take advantage of this, because rather than discriminating by gender or sexuality, today it's by class. Poorer British citizens, married or unmarried, LGBTQ or straight, are actually not allowed to have their partners or their children come to live with them unless they earn a salary of over £29,000 or above a year. No one's ever adequately explained to me why your access to this right as a British citizen should be restricted based on how rich you are. But obviously it's a good, easy target for lowering immigration numbers because the poor aren't people who have resources to challenge it. Of course, for me, the most appalling aspect of this law is it means that often children are being raised without one of their parents, because it's, of course, preferable that a child has no parent to a poor foreign parent.
It's really unbelievable, I think, for people from many countries. Although, actually, I have to say this is now spreading, this idea. So if this is coming to your country, watch for this. This is the sort of thing that gets done quietly and under the radar. But the idea that you would not be able to bring your romantic partner or your spouse to come live with you is absolutely ridiculous. And this is what controls on immigration mean. It means things like this.
Yeah, yeah. It's a sore spot for me personally, for obvious reasons, but I think it's also useful to talk about because it's this sort of example of this egregious rightwards shift of British politics on immigration under New Labour that really embraced part of their sort of triangulation policy on controversial political hot potatoes. And it's a sign of what happens when you triangulate, that the party that first introduces right for LGBTQ people to be able to bring their unmarried partners to live with them led to the same sort of policies that we see today with the minimum income requirement. But actually, it wasn't until the year 2000, so 3 years into this supposedly massively reforming government, that the next major change happened for LGBTQ people in the UK. And again, this actually wasn't a piece of legislation, but it was a legal ruling. 3 former British military personnel who had been fired for being gay took the government to court to overturn the ruling against gay people serving in the military. And it failed all the way up to the Court of Appeal. But supported by Stonewall, they took their challenge to the European Court of Human Rights. And they won on the ground for their dismissal, and the prohibition of gays in the military was a breach of the European Convention on Human Rights. That was actually probably quite a good outcome for the government. Like so many cases, they could sort of pretend their hand was forced by the European Court on this knotty issue that sort of wouldn't produce enough return on any investment of their political capital to get it through. But despite the outspoken voices against an end to the ban, the majority of the country, and even a majority of Tories, had agreed with lifting it, and it passed with very little impact on the military, of course. But then I found out Alexander the Great was a fag. Talk about gays in the military.
God bless Nathan Lane.
But actually, it wasn't until the year 2000 that New Labour passed their first major piece of legislation on gay rights, when they equalised the male homosexual age of consent, and in fact the age of consent for anal sex in general, to the same as that for penis and vagina sex for straight people and lesbian age of consent. It'd been a long time in the coming. Protection of young men from predatory gay men was one of the key concerns, I think, in the passing of the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, which partly decriminalised male homosexuality for the first time and set the gay male age of consent at 21. In 1994, the Tory MP, Edwina Currie, had, to her credit, introduced an amendment to equalise the age of consent, but had been defeated in her own party. But in 1996, 2 cases appeared again before the European Court of Human Rights on the issue. And those cases were actually put on hold because the government said it was planning to do something, was planning to act. So Labour, when it came into power, had to act, otherwise they'd face their cases losing in Europe again. And in 1998, a Labour MP, Anne Keane, had introduced a similar amendment to the Crime and Disorder Bill. But the redoubtable Baroness Knight, who we talked about in episode 2, was on the case and saw that it got blocked in the Lords. And at that point, Labour dropped it. So it was another 2 years to finally get the change through, and it was repeatedly blocked by the House of Lords until in the year 2000 it finally passed. But again, the degree of sort of government enthusiasm about it was relatively low. They actually allowed MPs to have a free vote rather than whipping them. So in the UK, under the parliamentary system, you have these things called whips. It's a way to sort of keep party order in order to pass your legislative agenda. And you as an MP is expected to vote with the government. If you don't, you're called a rebel. And there's some people who are very frequently rebels, but you have these people called government whips who sort of cajole and threaten and bribe the MPs to follow in the government line. But when there's issues that are seen to be issues of deep ethical importance and not about something like passing a legislative agenda, so for example on things like abortion or the death penalty, then MPs are often given what they call a free vote, and they can vote with their conscience and they're not bound by the government whips. So this was seen as one of those issues. Conservatives in Parliament and the press, who opposed the equalisation, again adopted all these old bigoted points that Baroness Young so loved, that young men were more at risk than young women, they were more easily corruptible, that older gay men were more predatory than older straight men, bizarre idea, that homosexuals were reservoirs of venereal disease and other filth and children need to be protected from them. But they didn't so much adopt this 1980s line that gay rights were the demands of this sort of swivel-eyed Bolshevik loony leftism. Instead, this new trope attached itself to New Labour. And that was that gays were a cosmopolitan elite. They were out of touch with the authentic British person, but they were massively overpowered due to their infiltration of media and politics. In the debates, the Tory MP Theresa Gorman said, quote, "Clearly there is a great deal of support for the change among what might be called the chattering classes, and certainly in the media. Nobody denies that there is a disproportionate number of homosexuals in these communities. In the run-up to the general election, not the immediate run-up, but a period since 1994, there would have been every good reason for the Labour Party to want to come to terms with these people. It certainly would have received a lot of pressure from them. I believe that the government have, to some extent, played up that powerful and influential group in our society," end quote. And that, I think, is a very important shift in the discourse from homosexuals being these sort of sad, abject people, or even these leftist perverts, to this like idea of them as a new establishment, a gay mafia that's in some ways more powerful than these poor, underrepresented, meager heterosexuals, and who are attempting to shift the laws in their favour, presumably for the same reasons, in order to be predators on the young men. And I think like figures like Peter Mandelson and this wider acceptance of gays in the media certainly contributed to that idea of a gay mafia.
It strikes me, Hugh, that if that law had not been changed then, it would never be changed now. And it also strikes me that there would be actually a kind of weird left-right alliance to keep it that way.
Yeah, I could see actually.
Can't you imagine what social media age gap discourse would do to an attempt to equalize age of consent at one unified level?
Well, I think what would happen is you'd see a campaign to equalise the age of consent, but at the age 21. You know, they'd want straight people not to have it to 21. Right. Yeah, the discussion around it is mixed of these sort of different impulses. One of which is a sort of to try to discuss how to safely protect young people who are engaging in sexual activity from predation. So, what does it mean for an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old to have sex, and those sort of the idea of a staggered age of consent? But there's also a deep moral position as well, which is that sex is something that young people don't do or shouldn't do and need to be protected from in toto. And I think what's happened in the last 20 years or even 15 years is you've seen a massive rise in that from within queer communities and within the left, also towards what I regard as a position which is to do with like the moral aptitude of young people to be able to consent, rather than the idea of protecting young people who might be vulnerable from predation.
Right.
But at this time, I think representation of gay and lesbian people was really changing in the media. And so when the British superstar George Michael was outed in a police sting operation in 1998, he actually reacted very differently to most of those who'd endured the same fate before him. And rather than respond with apologies and going into hiding, he came out very publicly and he spoke up for himself in a very brave and bold way. You know, perhaps it's because this was when I was first exploring my sexuality, but I really think that little shift in the approach to outing really moved the needle, really won a lot of support and sympathy from people who would have not felt that way if he'd sort of backed back into the closet a little bit. As did the presence, of course, of a lot more openly gay celebrities. So when George Michael released his song and video for Outside, which was a response to that arrest for cruising, it was very clear that there was this wider shift in mood that was beginning to happen. Anyone who saw that video then and now could be left in no doubt at all that gay sex was much sexier than it was abject. You know, like it looks amazing. The guys are hot. They're having a good time. It's very, you know, it's a very different approach towards it. And likewise, there was this old generation of often closeted gay men who were on British TV who were, you know, understood to be gay but would never really talk about it. Would shy away, in fact, often from talking about sex in general. You know, people like Kenneth Williams, who I'm a huge fan of, but, you know, had a very complex relationship towards his own shame. But now that was sort of giving way to these people like Graham Norton, who started his own Channel 4 chat show, So Graham Norton, I think in 1998-ish. And So Graham Norton was very explicit, very shame-free in its discussion of sex and sexuality. Graham Norton himself was very open about his own sexuality and desires. And very importantly, the show was really tuned into the internet, and there was lots of stuff about how weird and sexy the internet was. So it was this sign of like homosexuality being part of this more modern world.
By the way, if listeners who've ever seen Graham Norton or heard Graham Norton open his mouth are confused by the idea of Graham Norton being closeted, remember that at this time, Rosie O'Donnell was talking talking about her crush on Tom Cruise.
Yeah, there was a sort of don't ask, don't tell policy in some ways around people's sexuality.
To quote Joan Rivers when Rosie O'Donnell come out of the closet, "How was she ever in the closet? That woman douches with Gatorade."
Well, while these changes definitely did contribute to this wider sort of cultural shift in attitudes towards gay men especially, they also contributed to this idea that poofs, that gays were everywhere at the top of society, the top of the BBC, the top of government, that they were the powerful people in society. And this wasn't just the view of these sort of crusty old home counties Tories. It was a very widespread perception. I think you can see it in stuff like Private Eyes, It's Growing Up in North London, which is this comic strip about two Islington men, which launched in 1999. And they are this ambiguous couple, maybe, but they're these very pretentious, gentrifying hipsters with very expensive taste. So this spectre of gay men as being either tragic or lecherous that had persisted in popular media since the Dirk Bogarde film Victim, and in many ways deepened during the AIDS crisis, was beginning to lift. In 1999, the TV show Queer as Folk debuted, the UK version, the original, in which the main character is this very arrogant, flashy advertising executive. I remember in the first episode, I think he's in a meeting and he sort of sees this guy opposite who's he's into. He doesn't know if he's gay or not, so he goes to the bathroom and he puts on a little red AIDS ribbon. So as much to try and pull this guy as to sort of make this morning. And it's like a very subtle, thoughtful, funny example at the time. Or, of course, there was this hit British film, Forwardings in a Funeral, which shown a gay couple at the centre of this group of single heterosexuals. Traitors in our midst, I think is the line from the film. And with the gay character who died, but he died not from an AIDS-related illness, but rather from, an excess of joy. He keels over of a heart attack after drinking and eating and dancing too much at the wedding of a Tory MP. So these were not representations of men living on the edges of society. Stephen Bailey, the design guru who had quit his job as the Dome's design supremo, thought he knew where the blame lay. In Paul Routledge's 1999 biography of Mandelson, which does tend to lean into the scurrilous, it was called Mandy, Bailey said that it was homos who disrupted the entire system. Quote, "They have moved government out of Parliament into the media and culture. It strikes me as unhealthy. What's worrying is that people of power and influence are involved in an interest group which just happens to be a sexual one. It's a secretive interest group. It just happens to be about male gay sex. It could be badger baiting, but they have a secret, or they consider it to be a guilty secret. It's both defined by the bonds of secrecy and strengthened by them. As soon as those bonds are loosened, its powers are diminished. Mandelson's power depends on not being seen," end quote.
Well, no, motherfucker, you're the one who's making it a secret by making it impossible for anyone to come out, or else they get, piled upon by your kind of media.
Yeah, it's heterosexuality that makes the closet in the first place. And Bailey's position was shared by Richard Littlejohn, a notorious right-wing journalist, is pushing it, opinion writer, I guess, who wrote for The Sun, who clearly must not have been informed of their new enlightened pro-gay editorial line when he wrote at the time, quote, "The truth is that there is a virtual Freemasonry of homosexuals operating at the highest levels in politics, in the media, especially television, and within Buckingham Palace," end quote. So much like the uncovering of John Vassell as a homosexual spy in 1962 confirmed this wider public suspicion that homosexuals are somehow intrinsically linked to sedition, so Mandelson's career at this time confirmed suspicions of this gay mafia and more generally of the corruption of gay men. This would come to a head in the days before Christmas in 1998 when The Guardian ran an article revealing Mandelson's enormous loan at preferential rates, lower than the market interest rate, from another Labour MP, Geoffrey Robinson, as we discussed in last week's episode. And it wasn't just the unorthodox loan that was the issue, but how Mandelson had handled it. He hadn't declared it in the Register of Members' Financial Interests, which is an anti-corruption initiative that oversees MPs' relevant financial dealings. For a long time, he hadn't even told Tony Blair. He hadn't even declared it to the building society that provided the mortgage for the rest of the cost of the home. But there was another, perhaps more serious problem. Mandelson's department, the Department for Trade and Industry, was in the middle of pushing a major court case, and the case was looking into the collapse of Robert Maxwell's business empire. And included in this empire was one of his former business associates who was restructuring one of the Maxwell family firms, or had been in the early 90s. That business associate was Geoffrey Robinson. So Mandelson's department was investigating the business dealings of a fellow minister who also happened to have loaned him a huge chunk of cash, a very low interest rate to buy a house, yet Mandelson hadn't recused himself from this situation. So it was one of the first major scandals to hit a government which had won power on a manifesto promising to sort of clean up British politics and to tackle sleaze. Mandelson and Robinson were both forced to resign, with Blair telling Peter that it was probably in his best long-term interest to do so. The right-wing press, of course, had a field day. It felt like they had scalped their first major New Labour figure.
And as hard as it is for listeners now to imagine, given that New Labour had come in with this sense of almost religious revival and renewal, and given all of the sort of sleaze scandals of the 90s, at this point, it really did feel like they had sort of caught a nun doing something very naughty. Like now New Labour is basically associated with this kind of scandal, but at that point, New Labour was supposed to be the kind of clean alternative. That's really how they marketed themselves at the beginning.
Yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily a religious revival. I think to talk about religion is really an interesting point you're making, but there's this big position within the Labour Party, which we've talked on before, that it's a socialist party that derives, the traditional phrase is it's a socialism that comes from Methodism, not Marx. And so it's more about this sort of traditional Methodist, honest, decent, fair system rather than the idea of a class struggle form of socialism. And yeah, that's obviously
Right.
that sort of Protestant idea of fair dealing is obviously what's at stake here in their reputation. So here's an article from the Daily Telegraph at the time about the impact of Mandelson's departure. And prepare yourself here for some extremely purple prose. Quote, "Weep, O ye shirt makers of Jermyn Street, ye cool Britannia tailors, and whatever exists of human finer feeling. In the Ministry of Sound, the tank-topped bum boys blub into their pills. In the delicatessence of Elgin Crescent, the sawdust is sodden with tears. For months, years, Carla Pole will go into mourning, her plumage as black as night. For Mandy is dead, dead ere his prime. Yes, one can already hear the chokes and the sobs, even from those left-wing quarters that were yesterday calling for his pomaded scalp. So noble, so honourable, fell on his own sword. A good end, so unlike the other lot. In the soft-lit Soho drinking clubs frequented by Mandy and his pals, his deed will be likened to Captain Oates stepping out into the blizzard to spare his comrades. We are asked to imagine a kind of pre-Raphaelite scene, the self-sacrifice of Mandy," end quote. Ben, who do you think wrote that?
God.
Who do you
I
think
have
wrote
no
that? Very,
clue.
very, very homophobic, very, purple, shitty prose.
Who wrote that?
I'll tell you who wrote that. It was future Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, talking about his tank top bum boys.
Was.
Yeah.
Of course it was. And by the way, no one at Ministry of Sound was particularly mourning Peter Mandelson. It's like this weird, yeah, you understand what I mean.
Yes, of course. In reality, though, a much bigger scandal was brewing, but it was one that would actually take another 2 decades to emerge. So while at the Department of Trade and Industry, Mandelson was overseeing a very bold, very New Labour piece of reform at the post office. Using a PFI model, the private financing initiative that they were so fond of, they wanted to introduce a new computer system that would allow benefit claimants to collect their payments using swipe cards at post offices. And this new computer system as a project failed. It was a colossal waste of public money. But the politicians felt that something had to be saved in order to justify the project. So while the benefit scheme itself didn't go ahead, the computer system was used instead to implement a digital accounting system for all post offices. And this system was called Horizon, and it was implemented by the tech giant Fujitsu. But the problem was the system was very unreliable. It was full of bugs. And Tony Blair himself had been warned of this, and he was unsure about going ahead. He needed reassurance. He thought it sounded too risky. But Peter Mandelson was extremely keen to go ahead with it, partly to recoup something of their investment, but also because in his mind, the fate of PFIs, this controversial initiative of plenty of opposition, both within the public and within the Labour Party, the future of the idea of PFIs seemed to rest upon it working. And in a memo of the time, Peter reassured Tony. He also wrote tellingly that, quote, "Our relations with Fujitsu, a major inward investor into the UK over the past decade, would be severely damaged, as would the credibility of PFI," end quote. So Horizon went ahead with bugs and all. And one effect of these bugs was reporting a non-existent shortfall in returns from post offices, small local post offices. And so as a result of this shortfall, over 900 sub-postmasters So that's people who, they run a newsagents, a little shop or something, and as part of the shop they have a post office. And as a result of this, though, 900 sub-postmasters were prosecuted over the following decade and a half for fraud.
Oh my
Hundreds of
God.
them, yeah, hundreds of them were jailed. Many, many more went bust. Some lost their homes. Many lost, their homes trying to repay these losses out of their own pockets. There are even 13 instances of suicides of sub-postmasters in which the scandal was deemed to be a factor in their suicide. And what's
Oh
worst
my
is,
God. This is
yeah, this is
awful.
a huge scandal, the post office scandal that's sort of broken in the last 10 years. And what's worse is that both Fujitsu and the post office as a major organization and the Department of Trade and Industry, they knew of all these problems, but they covered it up. And the case was only actually exposed in the end thanks to the computer magazine Computer Weekly and our old friends at Private Eye, who I've hauled over the coals for a lot of their homophobic content in this series, but actually do incredible, sterling work in their investigative journalism. And then, of course, this guy called Alan Bates, who was a sub-postmaster who started an activist group called Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. It was undoubtedly one
So
of the
basically,
largest.
New Labor and the software company covered this up in order to avoid admitting that the software didn't work.
Yes, because to admit that the software didn't work.
Prosecuted 900 people, sent people to jail, and this is all Mandelson's doing.
Well, it's not all Mandelson's doing. It's a very complicated series of events. There's lots to read back over exactly what happened. The important thing is that Blair was reassured in the process by a memo from Peter Mandelson, and the center of that memo, of course, was this idea that it was important to the credibility of PFI that the project went ahead, even though there were doubts raised about whether it was actually reliable as software at the time. And because, of course, PFI was central to the New Labour project. But back in 1999, Mandelson was forced to resign as a result of the mortgage scandal. But his leaving was very far from acrimonious. Indeed, on the night that he resigned, Tony Blair and his wife Cherie actually invited Peter Mandelson up to Chequers, which is the prime ministerial country house, to have dinner and to spend the night with them. So I think it'll be to no one's surprise when less than a year later, in October of 1999, he was brought back into the cabinet. So he's twice had to resign, twice been brought back into the cabinet. And this time he has an even more high-profile role, which is the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland.
How do they justify bringing him back into the cabinet less than a year later?
I think it was just the fact that he was needed. Blair had the political capital to be able to bring him back in. He had this massive majority. It was controversial at the time, but he's seen as an indispensable part to the New Labour project. And actually, we'll talk about this next week, because even Gordon Brown brought him back in the end when he was Prime Minister, because he was seen as being completely indispensable. And I think really that's at the core of him being reappointed as the ambassador to the United States under Starmer. He's seen as having these political skills that simply no one else has. As we'll see in this new role that he has as the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, which in his first ever speech, he actually described as the Secretary of State for Ireland, which is not a good start. But I think it is a fascinating appointment for him, because in one way I can see how he might actually suit the role. So New Labour had achieved one of its major historic achievements by signing the Good Friday Agreement, which is a multi-party agreement in the north, in Ireland, which ended the Troubles, which was this 30-year ethno-nationalist struggle between Irish nationalists and Ulster Unionists. I say a 30-year struggle, it's an 800-year struggle, but there was a sort of resurgence in the 60s when attempts to reform and bring about civil rights for Catholics in the north were violently crushed by the British, which led to a resurgence in paramilitary activity. Also part of this agreement was an agreement between Britain and the Republic of Ireland. So as part of the agreement, a devolved assembly for Northern Ireland and a devolved executive was to be established, so there'd be home rule rather than direct rule from Westminster. There was also a plan for the decommissioning of paramilitary organisations that was to be put into place, a commitment to what they called a normalisation of policing in the north, so an end to the army and the RUC being the main policing forces, a militarised police force, and a massive prisoner release of paramilitaries from both sides of the divide. And it was a genuinely extraordinary moment. It was flawed in some ways, of course, but it was this major diplomatic achievement that managed to win the consent of both communities. And the agreement itself was a massive, major milestone, but it was the middle of a peace process, not the end of the peace process. And a lot of the decisions, a lot of the agreements still had to be implemented, had to be achieved. For example, establishing an assembly. The early years would require this huge amount of very careful negotiation between all parties, not just between the Unionists and the nationalist political leaders in Northern Ireland, but between paramilitaries on both sides too, and then, of course, between Britain and Ireland. In part, its success in that process was down to Mandelson's predecessor, who was a very charismatic Labour MP called Mo Mowlam. And her informal style and her personal bravery actually managed to break through some of the traditional barriers within both nationalist and unionist communities, and especially to bring the nationalists, who would have a understandable enmity towards British politicians, to the negotiating table. But ultimately, trust broke down between Mo Mowlam and the unionist leaders, who saw her as being far too close to the nationalists. And so Mandelson's appointment was seen as a much more conciliatory move towards those unionists. And among his tasks was to oversee the creation of the new power sharing assembly and the development of the new police service of Northern Ireland to replace the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the old police force, which had links towards unionist communities, especially, and also collusion with unionists. So I can see how in this context he might have made quite a lot of sense, because like Mo Mowlam, his abilities lay in his capability at small p interpersonal politics. But unlike Mowlam, whose appeals were founded in a very grounded, casual nature, Mandelson's more courtly politics probably was quite reassuring towards the unionist leadership. And the real issue was that the whole process was brought to a halt by issues around the devolved assembly and the decommissioning of paramilitary arms. The Ulster Unionist Party refused to budge on allowing the Republican Party, Sinn Féin, into a power-sharing agreement so long as their paramilitary wing, the IRA, hadn't decommissioned their weapons. So the former Democratic Senate Majority Leader of the United States, George Mitchell, who had been integral to the peace process, was then brought in to conduct this thing called the Mitchell Review in the hope of easing the way through the talks. And Mandelson's actions here are really fascinating. He was seen by many involved on all sides as quite haughty, quite rude, snobbish even. But his positioning of himself as being much closer and maybe even in tune spiritually with the Ulster Unionists gave him this certain amount of clout within their leadership that undoubtedly Mo Mowlam had never had. He did things like approve the awarding of the George Medal, which is one of the highest awards for bravery that's awarded by the British monarch, to the RUC. And at the beginning of November in 1999, he also attended a Remembrance Day celebration at the Parliament building, which is a highly symbolic act for unionists. But a hot mic at that event picked him up, talking to the unionist leaders and quietly urging them to call the bluff of the IRA. Say, like, sign the agreement, force them to either decommission or to be outed as hypocrites. You know, see if they'll stick to their words and you'll look strong, whatever happens. Because if they do decommission, then obviously you've seen to have been the ones who'd let that happen. But if they didn't decommission, you'd be seen to have been betrayed by the whole process. And as with everything in Northern Ireland, attributing a single cause to anything is a complete fool's wager. But Mandelson, I think, undeniably played this big role in persuading David Trimble, who was the Ulster Unionist Party leader, to lean on his members to agree to the deal. You know, he'd just presented these deals previously to his members and said, you decide. And Mandelson said, no, you need to actually go in and back the deal. And so he directly appealed to the Unionist Assembly members himself. And he also showed actually a similar courage to Mo Mowlam. She'd gone into the Maze prison, which is the major prison for paramilitaries in the north, to talk directly with paramilitaries to back the process. And he turned up at an Ulster Unionist meeting to make his case as well. And the place was swamped by anti-agreement unionists. They actually had to bring in loads of RUC riot vans because they were trying to get into the hall. And they were chanting at Peter Mandelson, "Homo, homo."
Oh my God.
But it worked. And George Mitchell's plan meant that Sinn Féin could then take part in power sharing without IRA decommissioning having taken place, but with a firm commitment that they would start decommissioning. But by February the following year, the plan was in crisis again. Mandelson felt that Sinn Féin had failed in that commitment. And so in order to try to prevent Trimble quitting in his departure as the First Minister, he suspended Northern Irish Assembly and implemented direct rule from Westminster again. It was the first of many such suspensions of the Assembly, and ultimately Mitchell's plan did lead to decommissioning of the IRA. By the way, Ben, are you familiar with the name George Mitchell?
Yeah, he was a U.S. politician, right?
Yeah, the US is very important in the opening stages, especially of the peace agreement in the North. But he was the Senate Majority Leader But you'll also find him filed under M for Mitchell on the page after M for Mandelson in the birthday book of a little-known New York financier called Jeffrey Epstein in 2003, where he describes his friendship as a blessing. So that's neat. Yet by January of the following year, Mandelson's career was about to take another hit. He'd survived the earlier issue about his loans, but now new allegations were emerging. So you remember I said that one of Mandelson's strategies for the Millennium Dome was to recruit private investors to help fund the exhibition inside? So two of those investors were a pair of brothers. They were Indian billionaire businessmen. They were called Srichand and Gopichand Hinduja. And in 1990, the two brothers had attempted to get British citizenship, but they were refused. In 1997, Gopichand Hinduja applied again. Also in 1997, the two brothers approached the government about making a donation towards the Millennium Dome of millions of pounds to help support the faith zone. In November of 1997, Gopichand got his passport, but as we discussed, the Dome was still desperately in need of cash. Lord Levy, who was one of Blair's key fundraisers for Labour, was asked to step in and talk to the brothers about hitting them up for another cool £1 million, which is Lord Levy's strong point. It's thought that over the years he actually raised over £100 million towards New Labour projects. So much so that his nickname at the time was Lord Cashpoint. A cash point is a Britishism for an ATM.
ATM, yes.
Oh boy.
Okay, I'm sure all of that money was raised from deeply legitimate locations, and no one who gave any of that money had any sort of interests in front of the British state.
Right. Srichand Hinduja applied for a passport again in February of 1998. In June, they made a second donation of £1 million. He applied again for a passport, and in March of 1999, he got his passport. He became a British citizen. So causation is not correlation, we know this, Ben. But it was revealed at the time that Mandelson, after having talked to the Hindujas about this donation, then telephoned Mike O'Brien, who was the immigration minister. The implication alone was completely toxic, and so Mandelson resigned, although he still claimed he wasn't guilty of any wrongdoing. He claimed, not put pressure on anyone. He'd merely phoned O'Brien for clarity over changing immigration rules and how they might affect Hinduja's application. And in the end, an independent inquiry did find that Mandelson was innocent of any wrongdoing. But in terms of his career, the damage was done, and so he was out of the cabinet and a regular MP again. And in June of 2001, a few months later, he was languishing on the backbenches when a general election meant that he was again fighting for his life. At the 1997 election, he had been an MP whose name was probably known really only to those with a deep interest in politics. But these two major scandals and these three major cabinet roles had sort of thrust him into the public limelight, and he'd become a household name synonymous with some of the worst attributes of New Labour. As he geared up to fight the election, ousting him was looking like a point of pride for someone on the left. So Arthur Scargill, the National Union of Mine Workers leader, who had left Labour because they had dropped Clause 4, he stood against Mandelson as the head of his own new party, Socialist Labour. In the end, actually, Mandelson romped a victory. He had a majority of almost 15,000 votes. And at the vote count, he addressed his critics during his victory speech. Quote, "In politics, as in life, you have bad days and you have good days. And I think today has been a good day," he began. He had, he said, been revalidated and given a vote of confidence by his constituents, which was this strange formation, which puts his own political survival at the centre of the campaign, as opposed to, representing the needs of his constituents. But he continues, quote, "I'm grateful to Hartlepool for putting me back on the political map. Before this campaign started, it was said that I was facing political oblivion, my career in tatters, apparently never to be part of a political living again. Well, they underestimated Hartlepool, and they underestimated me because I am a fighter and not a quitter," end quotes. Well, never a true word was spoken, and it was quite the riposte to people like Hattersley, who, as I'd said in the intro to today's show, had confidently declared he's lost to politics forever. He's back in Parliament, and of course he's back again in court politics. There would be more fights to come, though, so join us next week for the final episode of Mandelson, A Homosexual History, where we'll discuss his ennoblement, gay marriage in general, and his marriage to his long-suffering boyfriend Ronaldo in particular, his involvement with Starmer at Labour Today, and his appointment as the British ambassador to the United States under Trump. And of course, we'll discuss what looks to be Peter Mandelson's Waterloo his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein.
And if you can't wait for the next episode of Mandelson, A Homosexual History, it's available right now to our Patreon and Apple Podcast subscribers to Extra Bad Gays. So click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or head to patreon.com/badgayspod and keep listening right now.
Bad, 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 bad gays, bad gays,